My favorite podcast to listen to is Aria Code, which is all about famous and not so famous operas. Arias are the solos sung by main characters in an opera, usually as a pause in the action. They explore the feelings and revelations generated during one moment in time and are rich in messages that resonate beyond the opera's narrative. Arias are often the pieces we know from operas. So while Ryan has spent Lent diving into jazz, I've spent Lent ruminating on opera. On the surface, these two genres are very different. Opera is by nature bombastic and loud. It is a dramatic spectacle meant to draw you in and hold you spellbound. Jazz has a more reflective facet. As Ryan has mentioned, jazz grew from the blues and often carries that softer, more melancholy side of music. Opera audiences have a history of being the elite. Jazz has a legacy as the music of those who are oppressed. Opera is a show. Jazz is an experience. But I think opera and jazz have strong similarities to each other. Ryan has spent Lent drawing out the threads of jazz that relate to the human and Christian experience. The highs and lows, improvisation, ensemble work, movement. Opera contains many of those same elements. You haven't felt rage until you've heard the Queen of the Night scream high notes into the stratosphere in Mozart's The Magic Flute. You haven't experienced triumph until you've heard Prince Caliph celebrate his survival through the night in Puccini's Turandot. Like jazz, opera technically works as a solo, but it is at its most magical when it is the work of dozens, sometimes hundreds, of artists. Both jazz and opera contain the struggles and victories of human existence. So, I'd like you to humor me and take off any anti-opera blinders. In the dramatic, sometimes unrealistic, but very human stories of opera, I think we can reacquaint ourselves with Jesus' role as Messiah and what it means to be a part of his upside-down kingdom. Let's start first with Turandot, Giacomo Puccini's final opera. Puccini actually died before finishing the score, leaving two composer friends to complete the work and premiere it in 1926. Our story starts in a fictional kingdom in Asia, ruled over by our heroine, the Princess Turandot. Turandot has sworn to never marry, and to every suitor who tries to force her hand, Turandot issues 3 riddles as a challenge. Those who do not answer correctly are put to death. Our hero, Prince Caliph, is the first to ever successfully answer all 3, and triumphantly claims Turandot as his wife. Underneath the political machinations of the prince and princess are a whole host of townsfolk, retainers, and servants. Among them, Leo, the caretaker of Prince Caliph's father. Leo plays an important supporting role throughout the opera, but we're left to wonder why a servant is given both a name and multiple arias until Act 3. In Act 3, Turandot, who is sworn not to marry because of a traumatic past, responds to Caliph's unexpected triumph with anger, distress, and fear. Caliph takes pity on her and offers his own riddle in return. If she can find out his name by the time the sun rises, he will give up his life so that she may retain her independence. If she cannot, however, he will proceed in marrying her. Turandot did not become ruler of her country because she's a woman made of sunshine and rainbows. This princess is fierce and dogged in her pursuit of the prince's name. When she learns that Leo knows it, Turandot commands her servants to make Leo divulge the information through any, and I mean any, means possible. Leo, however, refuses, even when Turandot threatens death. Secretly in love with Caliph, Leo knows that aiding Turandot will end in her beloved's demise, so she chooses to sacrifice her life for his. Enraged and desperate, Turandot demands the reason why Leo will not give in. Love, Leo responds as she lies dying. I will close my weary eyes so that he may still win. Leo's sacrifice stuns Turandot, who realizes that Caliph might be someone to trust after all. Caliph, in his turn, is able to successfully wed Turandot because Leo sacrificed her life for his. Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem began with his search to find a donkey, or rather, his delegation of that responsibility to the disciples. The disciples followed Jesus' directions to a T. Go into the village and find a donkey tied up there, Jesus says. Never mind any resistance. If you tell any naysayers that the Lord has need of it, they will release the donkey into your care. So like his birth story, the beginning of Jesus' death narrative starts with the Messiah on a donkey. As a child of the suburbs, I had to do some research on donkeys and their characteristics. I found what I'm sure Luke's readers already knew. Donkeys are intelligent, calm, trustworthy, and sure-footed over rocky terrain. In areas of extreme poverty, donkeys are the livestock of choice because of their reliability and resiliency. Wild donkeys in the arid southwestern United States are actually credited with the creation of oases. The herds paw at the ground, leaving spaces for rainfall to collect, and nurture creatures who come to the area long after the herds have moved on. In Turandot, Leo is our donkey. Leo is our gentle and faithful heroine, the one whom audiences cheer for and cry over. In fact, opera critics think Puccini was never able to finish this opera before his death because he wrote himself into a narrative conundrum. It is Leo whom we sympathize with and care for, not Turandot. Instead of begrudging or abandoning Caliph, Leo stays true to her heart and her principles, giving the gift of her life so that her beloved can have the life he dreams of. Leo places others before herself and relinquishes control over the outcome of her decisions, never knowing if Caliph really will find love with Turandot. In the end, it is Leo who drives the plot of Turandot, this opera named after someone else. Without her actions, neither the prince nor the princess would be able to reach the end of their character arcs. It is the servant girl who ultimately holds the authority. Both Leo and the donkey are symbols of the type of power Jesus seeks to bring, an unassuming type of power, a humble power, a power that comes from unexpected places. By his example, Jesus refutes the power of domination, control, and fear. Instead, Jesus' choice of steed places a spotlight on the type of power that holds others up and is reliable. Jesus' power also nurtures and grows. It faithfully creates oases in the desert for those who come after. This can be a hard truth to hear, or an easy truth to hear, but a hard truth to act on. The idea that power comes from unexpected places is one I have been taught and have believed my whole life. But sometimes, when I feel that one student is challenging my authority in the classroom, when an experienced colleague is actually really difficult to work with, when push comes to shove, it is so exceptionally hard to stay aligned with Jesus' example of humble, nurturing power. In 1986, the opera X, The Life and Times of Malcolm X, premiered in New York City. Composed by improvisational jazz pianist Anthony Davis, the opera follows Malcolm X through his life transformation as a child in Lansing, Michigan, to a teenager in Boston, to the civil rights and religious leader we know in New York City. Malcolm was the fourth of 7 children. His mother and father both worked for an organization centered around Black pride and self-reliance, and their actions caused violent backlash from white community members. While police reports never ruled conclusively, the family believed a local white racist group burned their family home and killed Malcolm's father, Earl. Malcolm's mother, Louise, struggled under the strain of raising 7 children in an actively hostile environment and was later institutionalized. As a child, then, Malcolm bounced from foster home to foster home before moving in with his half-sister Ella, who lived in Boston. Malcolm held multiple jobs in Boston and in New York City and was also introduced to life on the streets, dealing drugs, gambling, and stealing. In 1946, at the age of 21, Malcolm was arrested for robbery. In the opera, this moment is dramatized as a police interrogation. Malcolm's responses in the aria, "You want the story, but you don't want to know," clearly stem from questions we can guess the police officers are asking, but the answers aren't what we expect. Malcolm actually refuses to answer questions about the robbery, singing, "You wouldn't hear my truth," and instead calls attention to another crime. "My truth," Malcolm declares, "is white men killed my old man and drove my mother mad." Essentially, Malcolm's choice to rob a house is driven by other lawless choices made by people and systems that oppress and marginalize. Malcolm notably doesn't let himself off the hook. He promises that he'll do your time so you can sleep at night. But his use of "you" shows that he still places the true blame on racist systems and situations. He swears that his real truth is fury. "My truth is a hammer coming from the back." By the end of his life, Malcolm's truth evolves into a message of self-love, especially for marginalized peoples. It's a truth that is radical and disruptive to an order allowing white privilege to run rampant over the rights, lives, and bodies of people of color. Malcolm knows that it is a truth often silenced, an uncomfortable truth. On Palm Sunday, as Jesus rides through the crowds of Jerusalem, we hear another unpalatable truth. Even astride his humble donkey, the crowd seems to recognize Jesus for who he is. They shout, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." In the Gospels, Jesus is variously recognized as the Son of David, the bringer of the coming kingdom of our father David, the King who comes in the name of the Lord, and most simply, King of Israel. This is a regal personage, no two ways about it. But the Pharisees, those longtime detractors of Jesus' ministry, try to silence this message of Jesus' messiahship. "Teacher," they tell Jesus, "rebuke your disciples." In Matthew, Mark, and John, Jesus seems to ride uneventfully from the gates of Jerusalem to the temple. In Luke, the scripture we read this morning, is the only gospel to record this kind of pushback. I think then that Jesus' response to the Pharisees, the only recorded action Jesus took on his ride through Jerusalem, is significant. Jesus says, "I tell you, if these become silent, the stones will cry out." In other words, the truth will out through any means possible, even if those in power don't want it to. Malcolm X, a follower of Jesus in his own way, brings the Palm Sunday story into the 20th century. As a white person, Malcolm's truth of self-determination and radical love, especially for marginalized peoples, can be a hard truth to hear. Maybe it's unbelievable or harsh or unexpected. Just as Jesus' truth as the Messiah and the bringer of an upside-down kingdom was hard to believe for the Pharisees. But just because we don't want to hear or act on these truths doesn't make them any less true. I think Jesus' Palm Sunday actions provide a pattern card for us when responding to unexpected power or hard truths. Jesus will walk or ride alongside us in our joy. He will be our example, model, and guiding light through our fears and worries. But like Malcolm, Jesus will hold us accountable. He will not let us turn a blind eye or a deaf ear to the good news of an upside-down kingdom where the last shall be first and the lion will lay down with the lamb. If needed, he will ask the stones to shout the good news to us so that we cannot possibly ignore the path to the upside-down kingdom. The tool I think Jesus uses to demonstrate this upside-down power and share these hard truths is a radical sort of love. To show you what I mean, let's travel from a police interrogation to the winding roads of rural Louisiana. Some of you may be familiar with the book Dead Man Walking. Published in 1993, Dead Man Walking is part story and part reflection, written by Sister Helen Prejean. It was developed into an opera in 2000. Sister Helen, in her own words, grew up in what couldn't have been a more loving family. She decided to devote her life to the church at age 18, but describes herself as naive, totally unconscious, prejudiced, not taking into account the gravitational pull of generation after generation of poverty and lack of opportunity. Early in her career, Sister Helen moved into the St. Thomas housing projects in New Orleans, and she says, saw the other America. All the rules were different. Living with people who led vastly different lives than she had allowed her to learn all the systems that marginalize and oppress people in our land of opportunity. While she was living in St. Thomas, Sister Helen got the invitation to be a pen pal to a man on death row. She and Patrick Saunier wrote and wrote before Patrick invited Sister Helen to come see him. In the opera, Sister Helen's first drive to the Louisiana State Penitentiary and her response to Patrick's invitation is magnified and explored in the aria, "This Journey." Sister Helen wonders how she will respond to Patrick, this man who has been condemned by society for doing the very worst things possible to other human beings. As a bride of Christ, as a follower of the subversive Jesus, what is her role here? What is her responsibility to this man? Does Patrick want her to help him die? Is he afraid of death? In the car, she declares that he's still one of God's children. When he sees my face, Sister Helen decides, he's going to see dignity and someone who can recognize that he's more than that one terrible crime. From her first meeting with Patrick until the end of his life when she accompanies him to the electric chair, Sister Helen remains committed to those principles. She holds Patrick accountable for the terrible thing he did, but treats Patrick as a human being, worthy of conversation, commitment, caring, and respect, worth more than the single worst act of his life. Even at the end, Sister Helen tells Patrick, "I'll be the face of Christ. You look at me when they do this to you." She recounts that Patrick's last words were, "I love you," and hers were the same. "I love you." We remember Palm Sunday as a day of rejoicing. Luke's gospel describes the whole multitude of disciples praising God with joy. Matthew's describes a whole city gone wild with excitement. In Mark, the people gave him a wonderful welcome. Less than a week later, of course, this same crowd condemns Jesus to death. They cast lots to divide his clothes and celebrate his crucifixion. They mock him, calling him King of the Jews. In Luke's version of Jesus' entry into Jerusalem, this about face is foreshadowed. Even as Jesus rides among this joyful crowd, Luke makes sure to remind us that only the disciples are praising Jesus, not everyone. The Pharisees try even harder to silence Jesus' uncomfortable message. They tell Jesus to rebuke his followers for speaking the blasphemy that Jesus is the Messiah. Jesus even foretells the consequences of this refusal to recognize him and his message, but he knows that the people of Jerusalem will not listen. We know, too, that this fickleness will eventually turn into wholesale support for Jesus' crucifixion. Jesus is aware that his role as Messiah and his gospel of radical love and change is not a popular one. It is a hard truth to hear, that the power of this world will not transfer to the next. For his hard truth, Jesus will become a man condemned to death, a death row prisoner, just like Patrick Saunier. So like Sister Helen asks in her aria, what is our role here? How do we accompany our Messiah during Holy Week as the clock ticks ever closer to death? How do we stay faithful to the hard path Jesus invites us to walk with him, even when active detractors tear our commitment down? I think Sister Helen, who takes her cue from Jesus himself, shows the way. The only light that banishes this darkness is love. The acknowledgement of other people's humanness is our superpower. Sister Helen never gives up on Patrick's simple right to be alive. Jesus never shames us for sending him to the cross. Sister Helen, and ultimately Jesus, show that radical love is a powerful tool in any situation. It can conquer even death. One of my favorite movies phrases it this way: you like because, and you love despite. Despite the worst things that people do, despite the things that drive us crazy, we can still offer dignity, respect, and acknowledgement. In a society that often treats people with disdain rather than care, this choice can have an unexpectedly large impact. On Palm Sunday, Jesus gives us an example of a radical love that loves despite. To me, riding through the fickle crowd on his humble donkey, Jesus seems to be saying, despite your mess ups and failures and crimes against me, despite your refusal to hear the hard truths, I will love you as a child of God. Now you do the same for other people. Amen.